The Apache woman slept in my barn. By morning, she was in my bed. Samuel lived alone on the edge of the wide, open prairie. His small wooden cabin sat at the border of the forest and the grasslands. Each day he worked hard, tending to his small garden, caring for his few animals, and chopping wood to keep warm through the cold nights. Life on the prairie was quiet, and Samuel had grown used to the silence that surrounded him. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, the birds called to each other in the mornings, and the occasional deer wandered close to his cabin. He had learned to live with nature as his companion, and he enjoyed the calm and solitude, though sometimes it could feel very lonely. One night, a cold wind blew across the prairie. The air was sharp, and the sky was dark and filled with stars. Samuel had just finished his dinner and was settling by the small fire inside his cabin. He listened to the sounds of the night, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of grass, and the soft creaking of the barn door as it swung in the wind. Suddenly, he noticed movement outside. A shadow passed near the barn, and his curiosity grew. He grabbed a lantern and quietly stepped out of his cabin, careful not to make too much noise. As he approached the barn, Samuel saw a young woman crouched near the entrance. She was wrapped in a thin blanket, her dark hair hanging loosely over her shoulders. Her eyes were wide and alert, filled with fear, but there was also a quiet strength in her gaze. Samuel froze for a moment. He had never seen anyone like her before. Her clothing was different from what the settlers wore, and he realized she must belong to the Apache people who lived farther west. The thought made him cautious. He did not know whether she was dangerous or if she had been forced to flee from somewhere. The woman looked at Samuel with a mixture of hope and fear. She did not speak, but she made a small gesture, pointing to herself and then to the barn, as if asking for shelter. Samuel hesitated. He had heard stories about strangers arriving at night, and he knew it could be risky to trust someone he did not know. But when he saw the shivering figure, alone in the cold night, he felt a surge of compassion. He could not leave her outside to freeze. Taking a deep breath, he carefully approached her and offered a soft voice. "It's all right. You can come inside." The woman's eyes widened, and for the first time a small sign of relief appeared on her face. She slowly stepped forward, following Samuel into the barn. The wooden floor creaked under her feet, and the smell of hay and animals filled the air. Samuel set down his lantern and motioned for her to sit near the small pile of hay he had kept for his animals. She sank to the ground, wrapping her thin blanket tightly around her shoulders. Samuel noticed that she looked tired, hungry, and cold. He went back to his cabin and returned with some bread, cheese, and a cup of water. She accepted it with quiet gratitude, taking small bites as if afraid to eat too quickly. Samuel sat nearby, observing her carefully. He wanted to make sure she was safe, but he also realized he needed to understand why she had come to him. He tried to communicate gently. "What is your name?" he asked. The woman looked confused, shaking her head. Samuel realized she did not understand his words. He pointed to himself and said, "Samuel," then gestured to her. She hesitated, then whispered a single word, "Ahuli." Samuel repeated it slowly, "Ahuli, Ahuli." The sound of her name seemed to carry a quiet dignity, and he felt a strange connection forming between them. As the night deepened, the wind howled outside, and the temperature dropped even further. Samuel noticed that Ahuli was trembling, not only from the cold but also from fear. He brought an extra blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She accepted it silently, her eyes meeting his with a look that seemed to say, "Thank you." Samuel did not know what her story was, or why she had come so far from her people, but he sensed that she needed his help. In that moment, he made a silent promise to protect her, no matter what. Hours passed slowly. Samuel kept watch while Ahuli rested. He noticed how carefully she moved, how alert she remained even while sitting in the hay. He realized she had learned to survive in a harsh world, to stay cautious and aware of danger at all times. Samuel respected her strength and quietly admired her courage. He had lived alone for many years, but this encounter was unlike anything he had experienced. It was both frightening and fascinating to share the night with someone so different from himself, yet so human and vulnerable. At one point, Ahuli spoke softly, her voice barely audible. Samuel strained to listen, but he could not understand the words. Still, the tone carried emotion, fear, hope, and perhaps a quiet longing. He smiled gently and nodded, trying to show her that he meant no harm. She returned a small, cautious smile, the first real warmth he had seen on her face. Samuel felt a strange sense of wonder. He had never expected a night on the prairie to turn into such an unusual encounter. By midnight, Samuel realized he could not sleep. He kept the fire low and watched Ahuli as she dozed lightly in the hay. Every so often she would stir, looking toward the barn door, as if expecting someone to come for her. Samuel understood that her journey had been difficult and that she had traveled far to reach this place. He did not know who she had left behind or what dangers she had faced, but he knew that for now she was safe. And in that quiet, cold night, a strange sense of companionship grew between them. As the hours passed, the sky slowly began to lighten. Stars faded into a soft blue, and the first hints of dawn touched the horizon. Samuel felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. He had kept watch all night, and he realized that the barn, once empty and silent, now held a story of courage, trust, and unexpected friendship. He did not know what the morning would bring, but he knew that something extraordinary had happened in the quiet hours of the night. When the first light fell across the prairie, Ahuli stirred again. She looked toward Samuel with calm eyes, no longer filled with fear. Samuel felt a quiet pride and deep curiosity about what the future would hold. He had offered shelter to a stranger, and in return, he had witnessed strength, courage, and the beginning of an unusual and unforgettable connection. The night had been long and full of uncertainty, yet it had also been full of small, meaningful moments that Samuel knew would stay with him forever. And as the sun slowly rose over the horizon, painting the prairie with gold and pink, Samuel and Ahuli sat quietly in the barn, two people from very different worlds, brought together by circumstance, trust, and the quiet magic of a winter night on the edge of the wilderness. Neither knew what the day would bring, but both understood that this night had changed their lives in ways neither could yet fully imagine. When the morning sun rose over the prairie, it cast a warm, golden light across the land. The small wooden cabin and the barn looked peaceful in the soft glow. Samuel stepped outside for a moment to breathe the crisp morning air. The night had been long and unusual, and he felt both tired and curious. As he looked back toward the barn, he saw Ahuli sitting quietly in the hay, her dark eyes reflecting the first sunlight. She seemed calm now, though he could tell that fear and caution still lingered in her posture. Samuel realized that their lives were about to change in ways he could never have expected. He walked over to the barn slowly, holding his lantern in case the light inside was still dim. He wanted to make sure she was comfortable and safe. "Good morning," he said softly, though he knew she might not understand his words. Ahuli looked up at him and tilted her head slightly. She made a small gesture, pointing to herself and then to the barn, as if to say she was fine but uncertain what to do next. Samuel smiled gently. He had learned that gestures, tone, and small acts of kindness could communicate more than words sometimes. Samuel offered her a warm drink of water and some more bread. Ahuli took it carefully, nibbling at the food as if savoring each bite. Her movements were delicate but cautious, as if she were testing the safety of her surroundings. Samuel watched her quietly. He had seen many people in his life, but never someone like Ahuli. She was brave, but her courage was quiet and careful. She did not demand attention, and yet her presence filled the barn with a sense of life that had not been there before. After she had eaten, Samuel decided to try to learn more about her. He wanted to understand why she had come to him and where she had come from. "Where are you from?" he asked gently. Ahuli looked confused. She shook her head, and then with slow gestures she pointed toward the distant mountains in the west. Samuel realized that she had traveled a long distance to reach this place. He felt a mixture of awe and concern. The journey must have been difficult and dangerous, yet she had made it alone. Samuel tried to communicate more by pointing at himself and saying his name again. "Samuel," he said clearly. He then pointed to her. "You?" he asked, hoping she would respond. Ahuli looked thoughtful and then whispered her name once more. "Ahuli." Samuel repeated it slowly. "Ahuli, Ahuli." He noticed a small smile cross her face, a sign that she was beginning to trust him. That small moment of connection felt important to Samuel. It was the first step in understanding each other, even though their languages were different. As the morning passed, Samuel led Ahuli to the cabin. He wanted her to be warm and comfortable. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fireplace, a few pieces of simple furniture, and a small kitchen area. He showed her the bed and gestured that she could rest there if she wanted. Ahuli looked at him for a long moment, and then slowly nodded. She stepped inside the cabin and examined it carefully, as if evaluating whether it was truly safe. Finally, she settled near the fireplace, letting the warmth reach her chilled body. Samuel felt relief that she seemed more comfortable and less frightened. Samuel knew that trust would take time. He had seen fear in her eyes the night before, and he understood that one night could not erase the dangers she had faced. Yet he also saw courage. She had come a long way, and her presence in his barn and now in his cabin showed a willingness to rely on someone else, even briefly. Samuel admired her bravery quietly. He realized that their meeting was more than a coincidence. Perhaps it was fate, or maybe just chance, but he felt that this encounter was meaningful in a way he could not yet explain. After breakfast, Samuel suggested they work together around the cabin and barn. Simple tasks, like feeding the animals and gathering firewood, could help her feel more at ease and give them a way to communicate through action rather than words. Ahuli agreed, moving carefully but confidently. She handled the animals gently, speaking softly to them in her own language. Samuel noticed that she had a natural skill with the animals, and he felt a growing sense of admiration. Even without understanding her words, he could see her kindness and intelligence. While they worked, Samuel tried to teach her a few simple words in English. "Eat," he said, pointing to the bread. "Drink," he said, pointing to the water. Ahuli repeated the words carefully, her pronunciation uncertain but determined. Samuel smiled at her effort. Though communication was slow and sometimes confusing, it was also a way to build trust and connection. He realized that they did not need perfect language to understand each other. Small gestures, patience, and kindness could bridge the gap between their worlds. As the day went on, Samuel found himself asking questions in different ways. He drew pictures in the dirt outside the cabin to help Ahuli understand what he meant. He drew animals, trees, and simple symbols to explain chores and daily life. Ahuli responded by drawing pictures of her own, showing scenes of mountains, rivers, and people he had never met. Through these drawings, Samuel began to understand her life in a small way. He saw the hardships she had faced, the places she had traveled, and the strength it had taken to survive alone. Each drawing was a window into her world, and he felt grateful for her willingness to share it. By afternoon, the sun was high, and the prairie stretched endlessly around them. Samuel and Ahuli sat for a moment in the shade of a tree, resting from their work. Samuel noticed how carefully she observed everything: the movement of the wind through the grasses, the flight of the birds, the subtle sounds of animals in the distance. It was clear that her life in the wilderness had taught her to pay attention to details others might overlook. Samuel felt a sense of humility. He realized that, despite his years on the prairie, he had much to learn from Ahuli's experiences and perspective. As evening approached, Samuel prepared a small dinner of cooked vegetables and bread. Ahuli watched him quietly, her curiosity growing. She had learned to trust him in small ways, and now she observed his habits and routines. Samuel, in turn, watched her with a mixture of fascination and care. He realized that their relationship, simple though it was, had begun to form a foundation of mutual respect. They were learning from each other, sharing a world neither had fully known before, and finding companionship in the quiet, simple moments of life. The night arrived quietly, with the sky filled with stars once again. Samuel made sure the fireplace was warm and that Ahuli had plenty of blankets. She sat near the fire, watching the flames dance, and Samuel noticed a small sense of peace on her face. Though she had arrived the night before as a stranger, by now she seemed almost like a part of the small home. Samuel felt a growing responsibility toward her, a desire to protect and guide her as best he could. He also felt an unexpected sense of joy. In the midst of loneliness and isolation, he had found someone whose presence made the world feel a little fuller, a little brighter. As they prepared to rest for the night, Samuel reflected on the day. It had been filled with small triumphs, moments of understanding, trust, and shared effort. He knew that the coming days would bring new challenges. Communication would remain difficult, and the world outside the prairie was not always kind or forgiving. Yet he felt hope. He realized that connection could grow even in the most unexpected circumstances, and that sometimes courage and kindness were more powerful than fear. When he finally lay down to sleep, Samuel glanced at Ahuli one last time. She was settling into the blankets, her eyes heavy but calm. For the first time, he sensed a quiet trust between them. She had come into his life unexpectedly, but now she had become part of his world, if only for a moment. Samuel closed his eyes with a mixture of wonder, relief, and curiosity about what the future would bring. He knew that their story had only just begun, and that the days ahead would test their courage, patience, and understanding in ways neither could yet imagine. In the days that followed, Samuel and Ahuli began to settle into a quiet routine. Each morning they woke with the sun, tending to the animals and small garden around the cabin. Samuel would feed the chickens and water the plants, and Ahuli would help, moving gracefully and carefully among the animals. Though their words were few and often misunderstood, their actions spoke volumes. Each small chore became a way to communicate, to build trust, and to understand one another without needing the same language. Samuel watched Ahuli with quiet admiration. She was clever, attentive, and patient. Even small tasks like gathering eggs or collecting firewood were done with care and precision. She seemed to notice things Samuel himself sometimes overlooked: the soft rustle of a bird in the trees, the subtle changes in the wind, the faint tracks of a deer in the grass. He realized that her life among the Apache people had taught her to read the world in ways he never had. And though he had lived on the prairie for years, there was much he could learn from her eyes and her instincts. As they worked, Samuel tried to teach Ahuli a few more English words. He would point to objects like wood, water, or bread, and repeat the word slowly. Ahuli would copy the sounds carefully, sometimes with a little smile of concentration. In turn, she began to teach Samuel some words in her own language. Though he could not pronounce them perfectly, he tried, and they laughed softly at the mistakes. These moments, simple as they were, built a connection that went beyond words. They were learning from each other, bridging a gap between their two very different worlds. Evenings were quieter and often more reflective. Samuel would light the fireplace in the cabin and they would sit near it, watching the flames flicker. Ahuli began to share small parts of her story through gestures, drawings, and simple words. She drew pictures of mountains, rivers, and people, pointing to herself and then to these places. Samuel looked at the drawings carefully and nodded, trying to understand. Though the details were incomplete, he could feel the hardships she had faced, the long journey, the loneliness, and the courage it took to survive. Over time, a quiet understanding developed between them. Samuel realized that Ahuli had fled from a world where danger often lurked, where trust was fragile, and where one wrong step could bring harm. Her journey to his cabin had been brave and desperate, and she had chosen him as a safe place to rest. In turn, he felt a growing sense of responsibility toward her. Protecting Ahuli was not just a duty but a privilege, and he quietly resolved to keep her safe, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. One afternoon, while tending the small garden, Samuel noticed that Ahuli paused often, her gaze distant. He stopped his work and asked gently, "Are you thinking?" Though she could not answer in words, she pointed toward the horizon, then to herself, then back to Samuel. He understood that she was thinking of her home, of the people she had left behind, and perhaps of the uncertainty of what awaited her in the future. Samuel felt a pang of empathy. He did not know exactly what she had endured, but he could sense the longing and the pain that lingered quietly behind her calm exterior. In the following days, Samuel decided to take a cautious step. He wanted to help Ahuli feel more comfortable with life near the cabin, so he began to show her simple tasks he thought might be useful. He taught her how to light the fireplace, cook a small meal, and mend clothes. Each task was slow at first, with careful instruction and patient repetition. Ahuli observed keenly, mimicking his movements, sometimes making mistakes but always trying again. Samuel found joy in her determination. He realized that her willingness to learn, despite the challenges of language and culture, was a testament to her resilience and intelligence. Samuel also began to notice small signs of trust. Ahuli would smile more often, laugh quietly when something surprised her, and even offer little gestures of kindness, sharing food, helping with chores, or quietly arranging the barn. Each small act was a message. She was beginning to feel safe, and she appreciated his care. Samuel felt a quiet warmth in his heart. Though their bond was unconventional, it was real. They were building a friendship that neither had expected, one based on understanding, respect, and shared effort. Despite the growing connection, challenges remained. Communication was still limited, and there were moments of frustration. Samuel would sometimes fail to understand Ahuli's gestures, and she would become confused or hesitant. Yet, each misunderstanding was met with patience. Samuel learned to slow down, to pay closer attention, and to use other ways to explain himself, through drawing, pointing, or demonstrating an action. Ahuli, in turn, tried to be patient with his words, repeating her gestures and using expressions to convey meaning. Each challenge became an opportunity to deepen their connection, to learn more about one another's world. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Samuel and Ahuli sat outside the cabin. The prairie was quiet, with only the distant call of a bird breaking the silence. Samuel asked, pointing to the stars, "Do you look at the sky like this?" Ahuli nodded, then pointed to the sky, then to herself, then to Samuel. He understood that, though they came from different worlds, they both found wonder and comfort in the same sky. That moment of shared silence became a symbol of their growing connection, a quiet bond that needed no words to exist. Over the following weeks, Samuel noticed subtle changes in Ahuli's behavior. She moved with more confidence around the cabin, her eyes brighter, her gestures more relaxed. She had begun to trust him fully, and in return, he trusted her. They began to share small routines, fetching water together, preparing meals, or caring for the animals. Each day, they became more attuned to each other's habits and rhythms. Samuel realized that they had formed a partnership of sorts, a companionship that transcended language and culture. At night, when the prairie grew dark and the wind whispered through the grass, Samuel often reflected on the journey that had brought Ahuli to him. He wondered about the dangers she had faced, the courage it had taken to travel alone, and the hope that must have driven her to seek safety in a stranger's barn. He also thought about his own life, which had been quiet, solitary, and predictable until she arrived. Her presence had brought new meaning, new challenges, and new joys. Samuel knew that life would never be the same again. One cold morning, Samuel noticed Ahuli standing outside, looking toward the distant mountains. He approached quietly and asked, pointing to the mountains and then to her, "Do you think of home?" Ahuli nodded slowly, her eyes filled with longing. She gestured toward him, then to herself, then back to the mountains, indicating a mix of emotions, hope, sadness, and trust. Samuel felt a surge of empathy. He did not know if she could ever return home safely, but he understood that for now, this cabin, this prairie, and this small corner of the world had become her sanctuary. As the days turned into weeks, Samuel and Ahuli's bond deepened. They had learned to share life without relying entirely on words. Actions, gestures, and simple expressions became their language. Samuel learned to understand the subtleties of her expressions, the meaning behind a tilt of the head or a small smile. Ahuli learned to read his tone, his movements, and his quiet intentions. Together, they navigated the challenges of life on the prairie, finding companionship, trust, and a shared sense of purpose in caring for each other and their small home. By the end of Part 3, Samuel and Ahuli had established a routine of mutual support and understanding. They had begun to bridge the gap between their very different worlds, not only learning from each other, but also finding comfort and trust in their growing friendship. The quiet strength of their connection became the foundation for what would come next: challenges, tensions, and discoveries that would test the depth of their bond and shape their lives in unexpected ways. Life on the prairie had settled into a quiet rhythm for Samuel and Ahuli. Yet the world beyond their small cabin was not always welcoming. Though they had begun to understand each other and form a deep trust, challenges were never far away. The settlers in the nearby area were wary of strangers, especially those who came from different tribes and lands. Some were curious, others suspicious, and a few even whispered warnings. Samuel knew that any misunderstanding could bring trouble, but he also knew he had a responsibility to protect Ahuli, no matter the risks. One morning, as Samuel and Ahuli worked in the barn, a neighbor from a nearby farm approached. He was an older man, with a cautious expression and a wary eye on the young woman. Samuel introduced her as Ahuli and explained that she had come to his barn for safety. The neighbor frowned, questioning the wisdom of sheltering someone from a different world. Samuel tried to explain that she was harmless, that she had only come seeking shelter and warmth. The conversation was careful, slow, and tense. Ahuli watched silently, sensing the concern in Samuel's voice, and instinctively remained close to him. Despite Samuel's reassurances, some settlers could not understand why he was helping Ahuli. They whispered about strangers and danger, warning him that trust could bring harm. Samuel felt a mixture of frustration and determination. He knew that Ahuli was not a threat. She was brave, kind, and in need of care. Yet he also understood that perception mattered in their small, cautious community. Their life together would require patience, careful planning, and unwavering trust. Samuel accepted the challenge quietly, knowing that protecting Ahuli meant more than just giving her a place to stay. It meant standing firm in the face of doubt and suspicion. Meanwhile, Ahuli's past was never far from her mind. Though she was safe in Samuel's cabin, she could not forget the dangers she had fled. She often looked toward the distant mountains, remembering the people she had left behind, the paths she had crossed, and the nights she had spent alone in the cold. Samuel noticed her moments of quiet reflection and understood that they were not simply pauses in the day. They were glimpses into her life, her courage, and her resilience. He never pressed her for details but offered small comforts, like a warm blanket, a shared meal, or a gentle smile. These gestures were enough to remind her that, for now, she was safe. One day, Samuel decided to take a cautious step further in helping Ahuli feel secure in her surroundings. He began to teach her small survival skills that could be useful if she ever had to leave or face danger. He showed her how to light a fire quickly, gather food safely, and recognize the signs of approaching weather. Ahuli learned quickly, absorbing each lesson with determination and focus. Samuel realized that she was not only resilient but also intelligent, with an instinctive understanding of the world around her. Her ability to adapt amazed him and reminded him of the strength that had brought her to his barn in the first place. Even as they grew closer, there were moments of tension and misunderstanding. Sometimes, Samuel would misinterpret a gesture or expression, and Ahuli would become frustrated or withdraw. At other times, the settlers' doubts created unease, making Samuel question whether he was doing the right thing. Yet, each challenge also offered an opportunity to grow. Samuel learned to listen more carefully, to observe more closely, and to act with patience and care. Ahuli, in turn, learned to trust his intentions, to rely on his guidance, and to find courage in their shared space. Their bond, though tested, became stronger with each challenge. One evening, as the sun began to set over the prairie, Samuel noticed Ahuli standing at the edge of the cabin, looking toward the horizon. He approached quietly and asked, through gestures and gentle words, if she was thinking of home. Ahuli nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting a mixture of longing, sadness, and hope. She pointed to herself, then to Samuel, and then back to the mountains, signaling the complex emotions she carried. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, understanding that her heart and mind were divided between her past and her present, between fear and trust. That night, a strong wind blew across the prairie, rattling the cabin and barn. Samuel and Ahuli sat by the fireplace, the flames casting warm light and shadows across the room. They had grown accustomed to the quiet and the routine, yet the world outside reminded them that uncertainty was never far away. Samuel noticed that Ahuli's eyes often moved toward the windows, alert and cautious. He realized that even in safety, her instincts remained sharp, shaped by the dangers she had faced and the need to survive. He admired her vigilance and quietly appreciated the lessons it taught him about awareness and care. As days turned into weeks, Samuel and Ahuli encountered small but significant challenges. They had to navigate misunderstandings with neighbors, learn to protect their cabin from curious animals and occasional trespassers, and manage the unpredictable weather of the prairie. Each challenge tested their patience, creativity, and cooperation. Yet through it all, they relied on one another. Samuel's strength and guidance complemented Ahuli's intuition and skill. Together they learned that even the smallest acts, sharing a meal, tending a fire, or observing the world carefully, could build trust, resilience, and mutual respect. One particularly difficult day, a sudden storm approached the prairie. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, the wind howled through the grass, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. Samuel and Ahuli worked together quickly to secure the barn and cabin, moving hay, tying down loose objects, and making sure the animals were safe. Despite the chaos, Ahuli remained calm, her presence steadying Samuel as he worked. He realized that her courage was not just quiet but active, a steady force that made challenges more manageable. The storm passed by evening, leaving the prairie fresh and sparkling, and Samuel felt grateful for her calm presence during the ordeal. Through these experiences, Samuel and Ahuli learned more about each other than they ever could have through words alone. Samuel came to understand the depth of her courage, her resourcefulness, and her quiet strength. Ahuli began to see Samuel not only as a protector, but as a companion she could rely on, someone who offered safety, guidance, and a measure of warmth in a world that had often been harsh and unforgiving. Their bond, forged through shared experiences and mutual respect, became unshakable, even in the face of external pressures. By the end of Part 4, Samuel and Ahuli had faced suspicion, danger, and the unpredictability of life on the prairie. Yet these challenges did not weaken them. They strengthened their trust, their understanding, and their partnership. Together, they had built a safe space, learned to rely on each other's strengths, and navigated a world that could often feel uncertain and unforgiving. They had proven that courage, patience, and kindness could overcome fear and misunderstanding, and that a connection between two very different people could grow even in the most challenging circumstances. The weeks turned into months, and life on the prairie became a steady rhythm for Samuel and Ahuli. They had learned to live together with trust, respect, and quiet companionship. Samuel could not remember a time when the barn and cabin had felt so alive with presence and purpose. Ahuli's cautious steps and observant eyes had become familiar, and her laughter and soft smiles brought warmth to the long days. The bond they shared had grown beyond the simple need for safety. It was now built on mutual understanding, patience, and appreciation for each other's strengths. Each morning, Samuel woke to the soft sounds of Ahuli moving around the cabin. Sometimes she tended the animals, other times she worked quietly in the kitchen preparing a simple meal. Samuel had come to rely on these routines, and he noticed that Ahuli had adapted to his ways just as he had adapted to hers. Though they still had moments of miscommunication, the gestures, expressions, and small shared routines had become their unique language. They understood each other in ways words could not always capture, and this unspoken understanding brought them comfort and reassurance. Samuel often reflected on the journey that had brought Ahuli into his life. He thought of the night she appeared in his barn, exhausted, shivering, and alone. He remembered the quiet determination in her eyes, the courage it must have taken to travel so far, and the silent trust she had placed in him by seeking shelter. That night had changed his life, bringing companionship and perspective he had never known. Samuel realized that their meeting had been extraordinary, a convergence of two lives from very different worlds, brought together by circumstance, trust, and fate. Ahuli, too, had grown in her understanding of Samuel and the world around her. The prairie, which had once seemed vast and uncertain, now felt like a place where she could rest, learn, and grow. She had come to trust Samuel not only for safety but for guidance, understanding, and companionship. The hardships of her past had shaped her, but in Samuel's cabin, she found a space to recover and to connect with another human being in a deep, meaningful way. She learned to rely on him, not out of necessity alone, but out of mutual respect and friendship that had grown steadily over time. One day, Samuel suggested they explore the nearby hills and forest together. It was a simple journey, but it offered new opportunities for learning and connection. They walked slowly, side by side, observing the plants, animals, and flowing streams. Samuel showed Ahuli how to identify certain herbs and small signs of wildlife. Ahuli pointed out tracks and subtle signs in the landscape that Samuel had overlooked for years. They shared quiet conversation in words and gestures, laughing when small mistakes were made, and pausing to enjoy the beauty of the land. The walk strengthened their bond and reminded them that life, even in its simplicity, was full of discoveries. Over time, Samuel introduced Ahuli to his neighbors carefully. He explained her story, emphasizing her bravery and the journey she had made to reach safety. Some neighbors were curious, others cautious, but slowly they began to see Ahuli as someone who brought no harm, only quiet strength and intelligence. Samuel felt a sense of pride in helping her be accepted, knowing that their connection had also helped others understand that trust and kindness could cross cultural boundaries. Ahuli's presence quietly changed the community's perception, showing that friendship and cooperation were possible even in a world full of caution and doubt. Evenings remained a time for reflection and shared calm. Samuel and Ahuli often sat by the fire, exchanging gestures, simple words, and drawings. Ahuli would draw scenes of her past, while Samuel shared sketches of the prairie and the animals they cared for together. Each drawing was a story, a way to connect their worlds and understand experiences that could not always be spoken. Through these exchanges, they found empathy and insight, learning to see life through each other's eyes. Their trust, respect, and friendship deepened, forming a quiet but strong bond that anchored both their lives. As the seasons changed, the prairie transformed with them. Spring brought new growth and vibrant colors. Summer offered warmth and long days. Autumn painted the land in gold and orange, and winter reminded them of the hardships of cold and survival. Through it all, Samuel and Ahuli adapted together. They learned to face challenges, celebrate small joys, and rely on one another. Whether tending the animals, mending the cabin, or preparing meals, they had become partners in life, supporting, protecting, and understanding one another in ways that words alone could not convey. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of red and gold, Samuel and Ahuli stood outside the cabin, watching the horizon. Samuel gestured toward the sky, then to Ahuli, as if asking how she felt. Ahuli smiled softly and placed her hand over her heart, then pointed to Samuel and the cabin. Samuel understood the meaning clearly. She felt safe, valued, and connected. She had found a place in this world, and in him she had found companionship and trust. Samuel felt a deep sense of fulfillment, realizing that their journey together had transformed both their lives, teaching them patience, courage, and the power of human connection. As months passed, Samuel noticed the small but meaningful ways Ahuli had changed the cabin and barn. She had organized the space with care, tended the animals with attention, and brought warmth and order to their shared life. In return, Samuel had taught her new skills and shared the knowledge he had gained from years on the prairie. Their cooperation and understanding had created a home where both could thrive, where safety, care, and companionship were constants, even in a world that could often feel uncertain. One quiet night, as they sat by the fire after a long day, Samuel realized that their connection went beyond simple friendship. It was a bond built on shared experience, mutual respect, and deep trust. They had faced challenges, overcome misunderstandings, and learned to rely on each other. Though they came from very different worlds, their lives were now intertwined in a meaningful way. Samuel felt gratitude and wonder, understanding that the most extraordinary connections could arise from the most unexpected encounters. Ahuli, too, reflected on their shared journey. She had come to the cabin as a stranger, seeking warmth and safety, and had found a companion in Samuel. She had learned his routines, shared his challenges, and discovered the quiet joy of trust and understanding. Though she still remembered her past and the people she had left behind, she also recognized that this place, the cabin, the barn, and the prairie, was now part of her story. The bond she shared with Samuel had grown into something lasting, a connection that could weather challenges, distance, and time. As the story reached its quiet conclusion, Samuel and Ahuli continued their lives on the prairie with a sense of peace and fulfillment. They had faced uncertainty, danger, and doubt, yet they had built a life together based on trust, courage, and mutual respect. Their days were filled with simple work, quiet reflection, shared laughter, and meaningful companionship. They had proven that connection could flourish even in the most unexpected circumstances, and that understanding and empathy could bridge worlds, cultures, and experiences. In the end, the barn where Ahuli had first appeared was no longer just a place of refuge. It had become a symbol of trust and new beginnings. The cabin and the surrounding prairie were more than home. They were a place where two lives had converged, creating a lasting bond through patience, courage, and kindness. Samuel and Ahuli's story was remembered quietly in the community, a testament to the human capacity for compassion and understanding, even across differences of language, culture, and experience. Through their shared journey, Samuel and Ahuli discovered that life's greatest strength often lies in trust and empathy. The ordinary days on the prairie became extraordinary because of the connection they nurtured. They had faced challenges, navigated misunderstandings, and learned to rely on each other fully. And in doing so, they created a life rich with meaning, courage, and quiet joy, an example of how human hearts can meet, understand, and grow together, no matter how different the paths that brought them together may be.